It is autumn in 1973, and a man sits alone in the narrow cabin of a houseboat moored off the shore of Sausalito, California. The water outside is grey and still. The wood-paneled walls are close around him, the air carrying the faint smell of salt and old paper, and something else, sharper, that he does not bother to conceal. A tape recorder sits on the desk, its reels are turning, and the man is speaking, as he has spent most of his life speaking, in a voice of such unhurried authority that the words seem to arrive already arranged, already inevitable, already true. He had recorded more than 400 lectures. He had written more than 25 books. He had been called, by scholars who did not offer the compliment lightly, the single most important interpreter of Eastern philosophy in the Western world. He was expelled from a seminary he helped to build. He married 3 times and left each family in turn. He died at 58 years old, nearly broke, largely alone, on that boat. How does a man spend an entire lifetime teaching the world to stop grasping, and spend that same lifetime unable to loosen his own grip on the very things that were destroying him? Hello and welcome to The Long Shadow. This is the story of a man who freed millions, but couldn't free himself. Alan Watts. Before we continue, if you find yourself drawn to stories about the minds that shaped how we think about consciousness and the way we live, subscribe to the channel and leave a thought in the comments below. These stories reach the people who need them most when curious listeners choose to share them. And I find myself wondering, as we begin, do you believe a person can transmit a truth they cannot fully live, and have that truth still be worth receiving? I would genuinely like to read your answer. Now, let us return to the story. To understand this man, we must return to where it all began. Not in California, not in America, but in a small English village where a boy first encountered something ancient and felt, with startling certainty, that it already belonged to him. It is the summer of 1915, and the hedgerows along the lanes of Chislehurst are a green so deep it seems almost deliberate, the kind of green that only exists in the English countryside in the weeks before the light begins to thin. In the garden of a modest Victorian house on the edge of the village, a woman moves among her roses with the focused attention of someone who believes that order, properly maintained, is its own form of grace. Inside, a newborn sleeps. Outside, beyond the channel, a war is consuming a generation of young men at a rate that no one has yet found the language to adequately describe. Alan Wilson Watts was born on the 6th of January, 1915, into a lower-middle-class English household in Chislehurst, Kent, a village of respectable quiet on the southeastern edge of London. His father, Lawrence Watts, worked as a representative for a rubber company and was by most accounts a gentle, somewhat retiring man. His mother, Emily Watts, was the more forceful presence. She was earnest, religiously observant, and possessed of an intensity that moved through the household like a slow current. She wanted things done properly. She wanted her son to be good. The England of Watts's childhood was a country in the final years of one certainty and the uncertain early years of another. The war ended when he was 3, leaving behind a silence that was not really silence at all, but a kind of unspoken collective grief, a whole culture that had lost the easy confidence of the Edwardian era and had not yet found a convincing replacement for it. The 1920s in England carried this grief beneath its surface, even in its pleasures, and the 1930s were darker still, as economic depression and the distant rumble of another European crisis pressed against the ordinary rhythms of provincial life. The Watts household was not unusual in its Englishness. Church on Sundays, propriety at the table, feelings managed rather than expressed. The domestic culture of the English middle class in this period was built on a specific and somewhat exhausting discipline, the discipline of not appearing to be anything other than composed. To want too openly was considered a form of weakness. To feel too much and show it was bad form. The stiff upper lip was not merely a figure of speech, but an actual social technology, maintained with considerable effort by almost everyone. He was born into a world that prized containment above almost everything else, and he would spend the whole of his life arguing that containment was the source of human suffering. The argument was genuine. It was also, one suspects, deeply personal from the start. What is surprising about his early childhood is not that he eventually rebelled against English reserve, but that the rebellion took the form it did. He did not simply reject the culture that produced him. He went in search of something it could not provide, something with altogether different dimensions, and he found it, of all places, in the art and literature of a civilization on the other side of the world. The boy who grew up in the gardens of Kent would spend his life trying to explain Asia to the West, and the West to itself. He was shaped by England, but he was also, from very early, reaching for something England did not contain. That reaching was the first sign of the restlessness that would define everything that followed. The garden held its order. The boy inside the house was already looking past the fence. It is a weekday afternoon in the late 1920s, and a boy of perhaps 10 or 11 sits cross-legged on the floor of his bedroom in Chislehurst, turning the pages of a book about Japanese art with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands, even without the vocabulary to name the understanding, that what he is looking at requires a different kind of attention than the books at school. The images are ink on pale paper, a mountain rendered in 3 strokes, a figure beneath rain, bent but not broken, a single pine, spare and exact, against an emptiness that is not absence but something else entirely. The boy stares at the pine for a long time. The encounter that drew Watts toward Asian art and philosophy was not a dramatic one. There was no single book that changed everything, no classroom revelation. It came, as the most consequential things often do in childhood, through a side door. A friend of his mother's, a woman associated with missionary work in Asia, had brought back Japanese prints and decorative objects, and when Watts first encountered them, at around the age of 9 or 10, they struck him with a force that he would describe decades later, in his autobiography, as something close to recognition, not discovery, recognition, as though he were remembering rather than encountering for the first time. The specific quality of Japanese aesthetic sensibility that arrested him was what he would later come to understand as wabi, the Japanese feeling for the beauty of things incomplete, impermanent, and slightly austere. The inkwash paintings he studied as a child operated on a principle entirely foreign to the Western pictorial tradition he knew from school and church. Western art, as he encountered it, tended toward fullness. It filled the frame. It declared itself. Japanese ink painting, by contrast, used empty space as an active element, allowed the unpainted areas to carry as much meaning as the brushstrokes, and produced in the viewer a peculiar sensation, the feeling that the most important thing in the picture was the thing the artist had chosen not to depict. This aesthetic philosophy was, he would later understand, not merely decorative, but epistemological. It embodied a way of seeing the world in which absence was not lack, in which incompleteness was not failure, in which the space between things carried its own information. It was the visual expression of a metaphysical position that would eventually become the core of his life's work. But at 10 years old, he knew none of that. He only knew that looking at those images produced in him a sensation he could not find anywhere else in Chislehurst. He was a bright, eager reader, and he followed the aesthetic interest into the literature it implied. By his early teenage years, he had worked through what was available in English on Chinese and Japanese culture, on Buddhist art, on the symbolic vocabulary of Asian religious traditions. He read with the unsystematic enthusiasm of someone who has found a subject and does not yet know enough to know what he does not know. This is worth holding in mind. The emotional relationship with Asian thought preceded the intellectual one by years, possibly by decades. He felt the rightness of it before he could argue the rightness of it, and this order of operations, feeling first and reasoning second, would be both the deepest source of his communicative power and the point his critics would press, with increasing sharpness, as his career advanced. He was drawn to Asia not as a scholar draws toward an archive, but as a drowning man draws toward something that might hold his weight. That distinction was invisible in the enthusiasm of a child. It would matter enormously later. The books multiplied on his shelves. The sense of recognition deepened rather than fading with familiarity. And somewhere in those years between 10 and 15, the boy made a private decision that was less a decision than an acknowledgement. This was where his life was going, in some direction he could not yet trace, but unmistakably in this direction. The question was what to do with that knowledge in the world he actually inhabited, which was Chislehurst, which was England, which was a culture that had very specific ideas about what a young man of his background ought to do with his time. He found the beginning of an answer in London, through a door that was already open if you knew where to look. It is a grey morning in the early 1930s, and a boy in a school blazer sits in the nave of Canterbury Cathedral, the stone vaulting far above him, pulling the eye upward in the architectural grammar of longing, the choir, somewhere beyond the screen, producing a sound of great formal beauty. He is listening, or performing the act of listening. What he is actually doing is something quieter and more private. He is waiting to feel something that the architecture promises but does not, in his experience, deliver. Watts attended King's School, Canterbury, one of the oldest schools in England, housed within the cathedral precinct and shaped, as all such institutions were, by the conviction that English Christianity and English educational excellence were expressions of the same civilizational achievement. The curriculum was rigorous. The setting was genuinely beautiful. The school produced capable, well-formed young men, and it was, for Watts, both a genuine education and a source of growing unease. The Christianity he encountered at King's was, in the main, Christianity as institution. He had nothing against the institution as such. What he missed, and missed acutely, was the experience that the institution was supposed to transmit. He would write about this many years later with characteristic precision, describing the Christianity of his schoolboy years as a religion that had retained all of the outward forms of mystical encounter, while somehow evacuating the encounter itself. The church services were orderly, the theology was coherent, the hymns were well sung, and none of it, in his experience, produced the direct apprehension of something beyond the ordinary that religious traditions had always promised as their central gift. This was not adolescent restlessness dressed up as philosophy, though it contained some of that. It was a genuine observation about the state of English Christianity in the early 20th century, an observation that many serious religious thinkers of the period were making from inside the tradition. The mystical stream within Christianity had largely retreated from public institutional life into private practice and academic study. What remained in the pews was Christianity as moral framework, Christianity as community, Christianity as cultural inheritance. These were not negligible things, but they were not what Watts was looking for. What he was looking for, he had already found a preliminary version of in the Japanese prints of his childhood. The inkwash paintings gave him a feeling that the cathedral did not, and that comparison, imprecise and adolescent as it may have been in its original form, pointed toward the work of his entire career, the argument that what the West called mysticism, what the East expressed through Zen and Vedanta and Taoism, was not exotic or culturally particular, but was, at its core, a form of direct perception that any human being could in principle access, and that the institutional religions of the West had, through no malicious intent, made it harder rather than easier to reach. He found in his mid-teens a partial remedy for the absence he felt. The Buddhist Society of Great Britain and Ireland, known informally as the Buddhist Lodge and based in London, had been founded in 1924 by a barrister named Christmas Humphreys, and by the time Watts encountered it, it had become a serious intellectual gathering point for Westerners interested not merely in Asian philosophy as an academic subject, but in its direct spiritual implications. Watts began attending its meetings while still at King's, making the journey to London with the quiet determination of someone who has identified the only room in the city where the conversation he needs is actually happening. He was, by most accounts, immediately at home there. He was also immediately exceptional. The facility with ideas that would serve him for the next 5 decades was already fully operational. He could absorb a complex philosophical position and restate it with a clarity that often surpassed the original. He could move between traditions, finding the structural similarities beneath the surface differences, and do it without violence to either tradition. These were gifts of the first order. They were also, as the Buddhist lodge would gradually reveal, gifts that could exist entirely independently of practice. He was hungry for a direct experience of what Christianity had not given him. Whether the Buddhist lodge would provide it, or would provide instead a richer and more intellectually satisfying account of the same absence, was a question that would take years to resolve. He arrived at the lodge as a teenager and found, for the first time, adults who were asking the same questions he was asking. He did not find, quite yet, the answers. It is an evening in the early 1930s, and a drawing room in central London holds a circle of men and women arranged in chairs and on the floor, their ages ranging from student to senior barrister, the air around them carrying the slight formality that serious amateur inquiry always produces. At the front, Christmas Humphreys is speaking about the relationship between Buddhist philosophy of mind and the psychological ideas of William James, and the room is listening with the concentrated attention of people who have chosen to be here rather than anywhere else. In the back, sitting slightly apart, a boy of 16 listens with his whole body, the way young people listen when they have finally heard someone say aloud the thing they had not known they were waiting to hear. Christmas Humphreys was a figure of considerable force in British Buddhist circles for most of the 20th century. He was a barrister by profession and would eventually reach the bench as a judge, but his intellectual and spiritual energies were devoted, with unrelenting commitment, to the project of making Buddhist philosophy accessible to a Western audience, without condescending either to Buddhism or to Western readers. He was not himself a profound original thinker. He was something arguably more useful, a rigorous, clear-minded expositor with a gift for identifying which ideas, precisely translated, had the most to offer a mind formed in the Western tradition. He recognized Watts's gifts almost immediately. The boy was reading faster than anyone else in the room, asking questions of genuine quality, and demonstrating a capacity for synthesis, the ability to hold multiple philosophical systems in mind simultaneously and trace the lines of connection between them, that was unusual in an adult and extraordinary in a teenager. Humphreys encouraged him to write. He helped him think about the audience for his ideas, not the specialist audience of academic Buddhist studies, but the broader audience of educated Western readers who were intellectually serious and spiritually hungry and entirely without a guide. It was through Humphreys and the Buddhist lodge that Watts first encountered the work of Daisetsu Taitaro Suzuki, the Japanese scholar who had spent decades rendering the Zen tradition into English prose of sufficient quality that Western readers could encounter the ideas in something approaching their actual complexity. Suzuki's essays in Zen Buddhism were the most serious body of work on Zen available in English, and Watts read them with the hunger of someone who has been waiting for exactly this. Suzuki became, in Watts's intellectual formation, the dominant influence. Not a personal teacher, not yet, but a presence behind the texts, a voice that seemed to understand what Zen was from the inside and had somehow found the English words for it. The Buddhist lodge also introduced Watts to the theosophical tradition, to Western esotericism, and to the broader intellectual current that sought connections between Eastern mystical philosophy and the emerging science of psychology. All of this fed a mind that was, constitutionally, a synthesizer rather than a specialist. He was not drawn to depth in any single tradition, so much as to the pattern visible from a sufficient altitude, the pattern that suggested all genuine mystical traditions were pointing at the same thing from different angles. By the time Watts was 20 years old, he had assembled enough understanding, or what felt like understanding, to write a book. The Spirit of Zen appeared in 1936, published by John Murray as part of the Wisdom of the East series. It was, by almost any measure, an astonishing performance for a man of that age. The prose was clear and confident. The argument was coherent. The book explained the history and basic philosophy of Zen Buddhism to a general Western audience, with a fluency that made the subject seem, if not simple, then at least approachable. It sold modestly but steadily, and it introduced a generation of English readers to a tradition they had, at best, a vague and largely inaccurate picture of. He was gifted beyond argument. He was also, beyond argument, 20 years old and had never sat in a formal Zen meditation hall. The book was brilliant, and it was written from the outside. Suzuki himself, encountering the work, observed privately that the young author had understood Zen beautifully. He had also, Suzuki suggested, in all likelihood, never experienced it. Whether that distinction mattered, whether a person could describe a country they had never visited with sufficient accuracy to serve as a reliable guide, was a question Watts's critics would repeat for the next 4 decades. The boy who had felt something in the Japanese prints of his childhood had now written a book about the philosophy behind those prints. But the gap between feeling and knowing, and the further gap between knowing and living, were already visible to those who looked closely enough. The question of whether Watts would ever close those gaps would shadow everything he built. He was a philosopher of liberation who had not yet been tested by the demands of an actual life. That test was approaching. It is a London evening in 1938, and 2 young people sit across from each other in a restaurant, the city outside moving in its usual deliberate English rhythm, taxis and umbrellas and the smell of a coming rain. The conversation has been going for 2 hours. It has covered Zen and English poetry and the peculiar difficulty of being a person who thinks about things that most people around them do not think about. And both of them, without having quite said so, have registered that the other person understands this difficulty from the inside. The young man is 23. The young woman is slightly younger. Her name is Eleanor Everett. Eleanor's mother was Ruth Fuller Everett, an American woman of considerable intelligence and considerable will who had encountered Zen practice not as a literary or philosophical interest, but as a genuine discipline, and had pursued it with the seriousness that genuine disciplines require. Ruth Fuller Everett would eventually travel to Japan, study at Nanzenji under Nanshinken Roshi, and become one of the first Western women to complete serious Zen training. She was, by any measure, the real thing. Her daughter Eleanor had grown up in this atmosphere, exposed to serious Buddhist practice from childhood, and the exposure had given her a quality of attentiveness, a kind of grounded presence that Watts found compelling and that he recognized, with some accuracy, as different in kind from anything he had encountered at the Buddhist lodge. Through Eleanor, and more precisely through Ruth Fuller Everett, Watts gained access to a layer of Zen practice he had not previously encountered. The Zen of the Buddhist lodge was largely textual and philosophical. The Zen that Ruth Fuller Everett embodied was something else, a Zen of formal practice, of sitting, of the specific discipline of working with a teacher inside a tradition that made real demands. This encounter sharpened Watts's understanding of the difference between what he was doing and what the tradition he was writing about actually required. He absorbed the distinction intellectually. He did not, ultimately, respond to it by submitting himself to formal training. That choice, made in the late 1930s and never fully revisited, is one of the load-bearing decisions of his entire biography. He married Eleanor in 1938. He was 23. The marriage brought him, within the year, to the United States, where the Everett family was based, and where the possibilities for a young English writer interested in Eastern philosophy and Western spirituality were considerably larger than they were in England, which was, by 1939, preparing for a war that would consume most of its remaining attention for the next 6 years. America received Watts well. It was the right country for him, in ways that would take years to fully reveal themselves. It was younger, louder, more willing to take a chance on an idea before the idea had completed its academic credentials. It had more institutional space for the kind of interdisciplinary, cross-traditional thinking he did. And it had, in California especially, an emerging audience of educated, spiritually displaced people who were looking for exactly the kind of guide he was beginning to become. The marriage to Eleanor gave him Eleanor's intelligence and companionship, her mother's deeper understanding of Zen practice, and a new country. He was warm toward Eleanor, by most accounts genuinely so. He needed warmth. He needed to be loved, and he needed to be recognized. and both of those things were present in the early years of the marriage. But he was also, already, constitutionally restless. He needed movement. He needed an audience. He needed, always, to be explaining something to someone, to feel the attention in a room turning toward him and the ideas he was carrying. These needs were not incompatible with marriage as an abstract proposition. They were, in his particular case, almost impossible to reconcile with the specific demands of domestic life, which asked for presence of a different kind, a quieter, more sustained, less performed kind of presence that he found, without ever quite admitting it, genuinely difficult. He arrived in America with a wife who understood something important about the tradition he was studying, a mother-in-law who understood it considerably more deeply, and an appetite for the audience his ideas deserved. He found the country almost immediately. The audience would take a few more years. The marriage would not survive to see either. It is the winter of 1935, and a young man sits at a desk in a room in England with a stack of Suzuki's essays on one side and a growing pile of his own pages on the other, the lamplight yellow and close, the window giving onto a street that is dark and cold, and entirely uninterested in what he is doing. He is 20 years old. He writes with the speed of someone who has been thinking about this for years and is now simply allowing the thinking to find its final form on the page. The prose comes out nearly finished. The Spirit of Zen was not the first book written for Western readers about Buddhism, but it was something the earlier books were not. It was written for Western readers by someone who understood, with genuine precision, what Western readers did not understand, and what they most needed to hear. Earlier attempts to introduce Buddhism to English audiences had tended toward one of two failure modes. They were either too scholarly, dense with Pali and Sanskrit and the apparatus of academic philology, or they were too soft, reducing Buddhism to a vague Eastern optimism that bore only a distant relationship to what the tradition actually claimed. Watts managed to thread between these difficulties with a steadiness that was, for a 20-year-old, almost inexplicable. The book's central achievement was structural. Watts did not attempt to survey all of Buddhism. He chose Zen specifically, and he presented it not as a religious sect or a cultural artifact, but as a philosophy of consciousness with a clear intellectual history and a coherent set of claims about the nature of human experience. He traced the tradition from its Indian origins through its transformation in China, where the encounter between Buddhist philosophy and Taoist thought produced something new, to its development in Japan, where it acquired the aesthetic forms that had first attracted him as a child. He explained the role of the koan, the paradoxical question or statement used in Zen training to break through the habit of conceptual thinking, without either mystifying the concept or explaining it away. The originality of the book was not in the scholarship, which was derivative of Suzuki and necessarily limited by Watts's age and circumstances. The originality was in the register. Watts wrote about Zen as though it were a live intellectual option for a Western reader in 1936, not a curiosity from another culture, but a genuine alternative to the frameworks, philosophical and psychological, that Western civilization had on offer. He wrote about it as though understanding it mattered, urgently and practically, to the kind of person who might pick up the book on a library shelf in England and carry it home. This was, at bottom, what Watts did for the rest of his life. He made Asian philosophical traditions feel relevant rather than exotic. He translated not merely the concepts but the sense of relevance. And in 1936, when very few Western readers had any access to these ideas in any form, that translation was a genuine contribution. The book sold modestly. It was reviewed with measured respect. And Suzuki, encountering it, offered his private judgment. The young author understood Zen beautifully. He had almost certainly never experienced it. The gap Suzuki named was real, and Watts knew it was real, and for a time he told himself that the gap would close, that he would find his way into the practice as well as the philosophy, that the understanding would deepen into something more than understanding. He was a man who could describe the view from the summit with extraordinary accuracy. Whether he had ever made the climb was a different question, and the question, once asked, did not go away. The book made him known in a small way. It also, without his intending it, established the pattern that would define his career. He was at his most powerful at the point of translation, the moment where an idea crosses from one cultural or conceptual framework into another and lands, for the first time, in a mind that had been waiting for it without knowing it was waiting. The translation was real, the destination was real, and the translator stood, always, slightly to the side of both. It is the autumn of 1941, and a man in his mid-20s stands at the door of Seabury Western Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, wearing for the first time the plain black clothing of an Anglican postulant. The morning is cool and flat in the way of the Midwest in October. The seminary buildings solid and institutional, against a sky the color of old stone. He stands at the door for a moment before going in. Later, one of the older seminarians would recall that he wore the new black clothing with the faint self-consciousness of a man who is aware that he is putting on a costume and who has decided, after sufficient consideration, that the costume serves a genuine purpose. The decision to seek ordination as an Episcopal priest was the most outwardly surprising move of Watts's early career, and it remains, decades later, difficult to explain without doing justice to its genuine logic. He was known, in the small world where he was known at all, as a writer on Buddhism and Eastern philosophy. He had produced The Spirit of Zen. He was associated, in the minds of those who knew his work, with the Buddhist Lodge, with Christmas Humphreys, with the lineage of Suzuki's thought. The announcement that he intended to present himself for Christian ordination struck some of his colleagues as a kind of apostasy. But Watts had a coherent reason, and it was not cynical. He had become convinced, through his study of comparative religious traditions, that the mystical core of all genuine spiritual paths was the same, that Zen and Christian mysticism and Vedanta were, at the level of direct experience, describing the same territory from different starting points. He believed that the mystical tradition within Christianity, represented by figures like Meister Eckhart in the 14th century, and in Watts's own era, by writers like Evelyn Underhill, contained insights that were structurally identical to the central insights of Zen, and he believed that the Episcopal Church, with its combination of intellectual seriousness and sacramental richness, offered a vehicle for transmitting those insights to an audience that would never, in the ordinary course of things, encounter them through a Buddhist lens. He was not wrong about any of this at the philosophical level. The Christian mystical tradition was real, and the parallels he drew were genuine. What he may have underestimated was the institutional reality of belonging to a church. Institutions have requirements that ideas do not. They ask for obedience as well as intelligence. They ask for the subordination of private judgment, at certain moments and in certain matters, to a collective authority. They ask, in the plainest terms, that you live in a specific way. Watts entered the seminary in 1941 and was ordained a deacon and then a priest of the Episcopal Church in 1944. He was assigned as chaplain to the Canterbury House at Northwestern University, and he threw himself into the work with genuine energy. His sermons attracted students who had not previously found much to hold them in chapel. His counseling was thoughtful. His ability to meet young people in the middle of genuine existential doubt, without either dismissing the doubt or offering easy resolution, was widely recognized. He was, in other words, good at the priestly role. He was good at almost every role he occupied. The question was never whether he could perform it with skill. The question was whether he could sustain it when it made demands his nature resisted. He was ordained on a spring day in 1944, and he was genuinely moved by the ceremony. Moved in the way a man is moved by beauty he suspects will not last. The institution was solid around him. The ideas were coherent. The audience was real. And the private life behind the pulpit was already beginning, quietly and without particular drama, to come apart. He had found a role that gave his gifts their fullest expression yet. He had also accepted a set of obligations that he would, within a few years, find himself constitutionally unable to keep. It is a Sunday morning in 1946, and the chaplain of Canterbury House at Northwestern University, stands at a small pulpit before a congregation of students. His black vestments neat, his voice carrying the particular cadence of a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and has, characteristically, found exactly the right words for it. He is speaking about the nature of attention, about what it means to actually be present in the moment rather than merely occupying it. The students in the pews are listening in the specific way that people listen when something they already half believed is being said aloud for the first time, with sufficient precision to be believed completely. In the front pew, Eleanor watches her husband with an expression her friends would later describe, carefully, as attentive. The pastoral years at Northwestern were, by most available measures, a genuine success. Watts was a chaplain of unusual quality. He brought to the role an intellectual seriousness that the students responded to, and a warmth that was entirely real, not a professional performance, but an expression of his actual nature, which was genuinely generous and genuinely curious about other people's inner lives. His counseling sessions with students navigating the particular crisis of early adulthood, the loss of inherited faith, the encounter with ideas that seemed to undermine the frameworks they had grown up inside, were thoughtful and substantive. He did not offer comfort cheaply, he offered genuine engagement. The chapel services he organized attracted students who had not previously considered attending. The sermons circulated in typescript among undergraduates who passed them to friends. He was building, in the small world of a university chaplaincy, the kind of audience that his ideas deserved, an audience of intelligent, searching people who needed someone to think with rather than someone to believe at. Outside the chaplaincy, the writing continued. He was working on what would become Behold the Spirit, published in 1947, his most sustained attempt to argue the case that the Christian mystical tradition contained. In Eckhart and Ruysbroeck, and the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, a genuine counterpart to the direct experience emphasis of Zen. The book was serious and, in its best passages, genuinely illuminating. It did not sell widely, but it established him as a thinker of real depth, not merely a popularizer, but someone capable of original philosophical argument. But the years between 1944 and 1950 were also the years in which the gap between the man on the pulpit and the man at home became something he could no longer manage through the ordinary mechanisms of distraction and optimism. He drank more than was good for him, a habit that had begun in his 20s and was, by his mid-30s, no longer entirely within his control. He was drawn to other women with a frequency and intensity that exceeded any reasonable account of accident or temptation. He was absent from his family in the most literal sense, traveling frequently, and in a more significant sense as well, present in body but elsewhere in attention. Eleanor was not a passive observer of this. She was intelligent and honest, and she could see clearly what was happening. The marriage, which had begun with genuine intellectual companionship and genuine affection, was becoming a performance of a different kind, a maintenance of outward form in the absence of the thing the form was supposed to express. He preached presence from the pulpit with total conviction. He preached impermanence, the Buddhist understanding that all conditioned things arise and pass away, and that suffering comes precisely from the attempt to hold on to what cannot be held. He believed these things. He said them with the authority of a man who had thought them through completely. And in his private life, he held on with both hands to the habits and the distances that were making everyone around him unhappy, himself included. He was a man of extraordinary communicative integrity, and he was also a man whose private conduct was making a sustained argument against everything he publicly said. This was not yet catastrophic. It was still, in the mid-1940s, the kind of contradiction that many people carry without resolution. But it was deepening, and the institution he had joined would not, when the contradiction became impossible to conceal, offer him the room he would have needed to manage it quietly. The reckoning was a few years away, and he could feel it coming, and he preached about impermanence anyway, every Sunday, with his whole heart. It is a grey morning in 1950, and Alan Watts sits in a chair across a wide desk in a bishop's office in Chicago. The room is decorated with the careful sobriety that institutional Christianity in mid-century America considered appropriate. Dark wood and leather, and a window giving onto a courtyard where nothing particularly interesting is happening. The bishop is speaking with the measured language of a man who has thought carefully about his words, and has, in any case, already made his decision. Watts listens. He has understood, from the moment he was asked to come, that this conversation is not a negotiation. The end of his marriage to Eleanor Everett was, in its bare facts, straightforward. He had fallen in love with another woman, Dorothy DeWitt, and wished to marry her. Eleanor did not contest the divorce. The Episcopal Church, however, had no mechanism for accommodating a divorced and remarried priest. The canons were clear. Clergy who divorced could not remarry and continue in orders. Watts was informed of this reality with, by all accounts, considerable kindness, but without any ambiguity. He resigned his orders rather than wait to be formally removed. The distinction mattered to him. He resigned. The initiative, he insisted, was his. Whether this was psychologically accurate, or whether it was the story he needed to tell himself, is a question that cannot be finally answered. What is clear is that the departure, however framed, cost him more than he initially acknowledged. He lost his position, obviously, and the salary that went with it. He lost the community that had formed around his chaplaincy, the students and colleagues who had gathered around the particular quality of attention he brought to the work. He lost, less tangibly but no less really, a version of himself that he had occupied with genuine investment, the version that was answerable to an institution, that wore the vestments and kept the hours, and stood within a tradition larger than his own intelligence. What emerged from that loss was something more exposed, and in ways that were not immediately visible, more honest. He was now answerable to no institution, no bishop, no canons. He spoke only for himself. His ideas could not be constrained or softened by the requirement to remain within any orthodoxy. This was liberating in the deepest sense of the word. It was also, depending on the day and the decade, frightening. He married Dorothy DeWitt shortly after leaving the church, and he threw himself into the marriage with the energy that characterized all of his beginnings. Dorothy was warm and practical, with a steadiness that complemented, rather than competed with his restlessness. They had 5 children together across the years of the marriage. Watts genuinely loved his children, in the way that he genuinely loved most people, with warmth and attention and a certain structural unavailability that made the warmth, over time, feel insufficient. He moved to San Francisco. He was 35 years old, without institutional affiliation for the first time in his adult life, and carrying, alongside the marriage and the new family, the manuscript of what would become The Wisdom of Insecurity, published in 1951. The book was his first genuinely personal philosophical statement, written not from within the framework of any tradition, Buddhist or Christian, but from the place he actually occupied. A man who had studied liberation with more care than almost anyone alive, and who was, in his private life, considerably less free than his readers imagined. Here lies the resolution of that earlier question, the question of whether he could sustain institutional belonging. He could not. And the honesty of that answer, whatever its cost, was at least a form of clarity. He had left the seminary, he had left the marriage, he had left England. He was accumulating a list of departures that would, eventually, require some accounting. He arrived in San Francisco in 1951 with a second wife, no pulpit, no denomination, no salary, and an idea. The idea was that the ideas themselves, spoken clearly enough, might be sufficient. He was about to find out whether that was true. It is an afternoon in the early 1950s, and Alan Watts is walking through North Beach, San Francisco, with the slightly dazzled expression of a man who has arrived somewhere that suits him in ways he did not fully anticipate. The city has a particular quality in these years, something to do with the light on the bay and the density of the hills and the way the fog moves through the streets in the late afternoon, burning off by mid-morning and returning at dusk with the regularity of a tide. It is a city that does not entirely believe in the permanence of anything, and Watts, who had spent years arguing that impermanence was a gift rather than a threat, found in that quality something close to relief. He took a position as dean and lecturer at the American Academy of Asian Studies, a small institution on Jackson Street, founded in 1951 by the businessman Louis Gainsborough Hull, and staffed by a faculty that included, at various points, figures of genuine intellectual distinction. The scholar Frederick Spiegelberg, the philosopher and Zen practitioner Haridas Chowdhury, and eventually Watts himself as a central presence. The Academy was not a large or prestigious institution by conventional measures. It did not grant degrees recognized by the standard academic bodies. What it did was gather, in a single place, a serious and eclectic group of thinkers committed to the proposition that Western and Eastern philosophical traditions had things to learn from each other, and that the conversation between them was urgent rather than merely interesting. Watts thrived there in the way that suited plants thrive when, after years in insufficient light, they are moved to a window. He lectured constantly. He read voraciously. He assembled around him a circle of students and colleagues that included figures who would go on to shape the American cultural landscape in ways that no one in that building on Jackson Street could have predicted. Gary Snyder, the poet, passed through. Jack Kerouac's circle brushed against the Academy's orbit. The artist Allen Ginsberg encountered these ideas, however indirectly. The city around the Academy was assembling the conditions for something that would, within a decade, become the defining cultural phenomenon of American life. Watts understood what he was part of, and also understood that he was not entirely of it. He was older than the Beats, more formally educated, more philosophically rigorous. He enjoyed the energy of the emerging counterculture the way a craftsman might enjoy a festival, with genuine pleasure and a private awareness that the crowd, for all its enthusiasm, did not quite understand what the craft required. He was warm toward the Beats and respectful of their seriousness. He was also privately uncertain that their particular version of Zen was doing the tradition any great favors. He began, in these years, to develop the practice that would eventually make him famous beyond any audience the Academy could provide. He started broadcasting on Pacifica Radio's KPFA in Berkeley, delivering weekly talks on Asian philosophy that combined the intellectual rigor of his written work with an ease of delivery that the broadcast format rewarded. The talks drew a following. Letters arrived. Requests came for transcripts. Something was becoming clear. The ideas reached further when they were spoken than when they were written. And the voice, with its mid-Atlantic cadence and its quality of absolute unruffled certainty, was itself a kind of argument for the content it was carrying. He was 36 years old, living in one of the most intellectually alive cities in the country, surrounded by people who wanted exactly what he had to offer, and working, on the evenings when domestic life permitted and the glass was at the right level of fullness, on the manuscript that would change everything. It is an afternoon in 1956, and Alan Watts is at his typewriter in a room overlooking the bay. The light from the water shifts across the ceiling in slow patterns. He has been working on this manuscript for months, and there is something different about the way these pages are coming, a quality of arrival that earlier work did not quite have. He types with 2 fingers, quickly, pausing occasionally to look out at the water, with the expression of a man who is trying to find the exact right word for something he understands with complete clarity and wants very badly not to simplify. The Way of Zen was published by Pantheon Books in 1957, and it changed the conversation, not gradually, immediately and lastingly. Within a few years of publication, it had sold hundreds of thousands of copies, been translated into multiple languages, and established itself as the book that an educated Western reader reached for when they wanted to understand what Zen Buddhism actually was. It has never gone out of print. The ambition of the book was considerable. Watts set out to trace the full intellectual genealogy of Zen, beginning with the Indian Buddhist traditions that preceded it, moving through the encounter between Buddhist philosophy and Chinese Taoism that produced the Chan school, and arriving at the Japanese Zen that most Western readers recognized by name but understood poorly. He wanted to show Zen not as a set of exotic practices or a collection of striking anecdotes about enlightenment, but as a coherent philosophical position with a specific history and specific claims about the nature of mind and experience. What the book addressed, at its core, was a problem that it identified with unusual precision, the problem of what Watts called the double bind of seeking. The central promise of Zen, he argued, was the dissolution of the sense of a separate self, the feeling of being a small ego located behind the eyes, persistently at odds with a world that seems to exist outside it and beyond its control. This feeling of separateness, Zen held, was not a fact about the structure of reality, but a learned interpretation of experience, a habit of perception so deeply ingrained that it seemed to be the nature of things rather than a way of construing them. And the liberation that Zen offered was the direct perception that this interpretation was false, that the self and the world were not two opposed things, but a single process experienced from different vantage points. The problem was this: you cannot seek liberation in the ordinary sense of seeking. The moment you approach the dissolution of the ego as a goal to be achieved by a deliberate self, you have reinstated the very ego that the seeking was meant to dissolve. Zen's seemingly paradoxical methods, the koans, the unexpected interventions of the master, the discipline of sitting without an object, were all attempts to cut through this double bind by approaches that the calculating mind could not anticipate, and therefore could not colonize. Watts explained all of this with a clarity and a formal elegance that no previous English language account had achieved. The book was not, at the scholarly level, without its limitations. Specialists in Zen studies found passages to contest, sources to dispute, framings to qualify. But for the audience the book was actually written for, which was not the academic audience of Buddhist studies, but the general reader of philosophical seriousness, it was a different kind of contribution. It made the double bind legible, made the problem feel real and personal, and not at all exotic, and suggested that the Zen tradition had been grappling, with genuine sophistication, with exactly the difficulties that any honest Western mind encountered when it tried to think clearly about consciousness. The book made him a public intellectual of the first rank. Reviews appeared in newspapers and literary magazines. Invitations to lecture multiplied. The radio audience grew into something resembling a movement. And behind the reviews and the invitations and the growing audience, the question that Suzuki had asked in private was now being asked more publicly. This man writes about Zen with extraordinary authority. Does he practice it? The question was fair. The answer was complicated. And the complication, which he carried with something between awareness and acceptance, was the most honest thing about him. He had written the most important English language account of Zen in the mid-20th century. He had written it from outside the formal tradition. Both of these facts were true simultaneously, and the success of the book made the second fact harder, not easier, to ignore. It is the spring of 1958, and Alan Watts is reading a letter from a colleague in a coffee shop in North Beach, the noise of the neighborhood steady around him. The letter discusses his recent essay on Zen and the counterculture, with the careful language of someone who is trying to be fair to an argument they find partly compelling and partly troubling. Watts folds the letter and finishes his coffee and looks out at the street. He is used to being praised. He is less accustomed to being right about something in a way that discomforts people, including people he respects. The essay Beat Zen, Square Zen, and Zen appeared in the Chicago Review in 1958 and was, among everything Watts wrote, one of the clearest demonstrations that he was a genuine critical intelligence and not merely an elegant popularizer. The Beat movement had, by the late 1950s, taken up Zen as something close to its official philosophy. Jack Kerouac's The Dharma Bums had appeared. Allen Ginsberg was writing poems saturated with Buddhist imagery. The coffee houses of North Beach and Greenwich Village were full of young men who considered themselves serious students of Zen because they had read Suzuki and refused to hold regular jobs. Watts was not dismissive of this. He understood the genuine longing behind the Beat enthusiasm for Zen, the longing for liberation from the suffocating conformism of post-war American middle-class life. the longing for a way of being in the world that was more alive, more present, less organized, around the accumulation of things and the maintenance of appearances. He recognized this longing as real and serious, as continuous with the longing he had felt himself in the nave of Canterbury Cathedral as a teenager. But he was also clear about what the beat appropriation of Zen was doing to the tradition. Beat Zen, as he named and described it, was Zen as permission. It was the invocation of a philosophical framework to justify whatever the individual wanted to do anyway, a license for self-expression and self-indulgence, dressed in the language of liberation. It had kept the form of Zen's anti-conformism while discarding the substance of Zen's discipline. It was, he argued, a mirror of exactly the ego it claimed to dissolve. Square Zen, the other object of his critique, was the opposite failure. It was the institutional Zen of formal practice, rigidly applied, in which the forms of training were maintained with such literal fidelity that the living spirit they were meant to preserve had been squeezed out by the pressure. Square Zen produced excellent practitioners of a specific technique. Whether it produced the direct experience that the technique was supposed to occasion was, Watts suggested, a different and less certain question. The essay was sharp and honest, and made enemies in both directions. The beats resented the implication that their Zen was not serious. The formal practitioners resented the suggestion that serious practice could miss the point. And both groups had a residual objection they rarely stated directly, but which was present in almost every negative response. Who was Alan Watts to make these distinctions? He did not practice formally. He had not studied with a teacher in the traditional sense. The authority he claimed was entirely self-conferred. The objection had force. Watts felt it and continued to write anyway, which was consistent with his position, the one he was about to defend more explicitly, that the very pursuit of formal credentials was itself a form of the ego's grasping. Whether that position was a genuine philosophical insight or a very sophisticated piece of self-exculpation was a question that did not have a clean answer. It was, in fact, the same question that his private life was asking in a different register, without his having quite noticed that the two questions were connected. He responded to his critics with wit and without capitulation. But the criticism lodged in him somewhere that wit could not reach. It was the philosophical form of the question Suzuki had raised in private 20 years earlier. The question had not changed. Only the number of people now asking it had grown. It is a spring afternoon in 1958, and Alan Watts is sitting in a room at the International Foundation for Advanced Study in Menlo Park, California. The room is clean and clinical, the light even and neutral. A pitcher of water on a table beside him. He has been briefed thoroughly. He has signed the appropriate forms. A researcher in a white coat has measured his pulse and noted it in a folder. He has answered questions about his psychological history with the candor he brings to most things. And now, in this unremarkable room in a building on the San Francisco Peninsula, he swallows a capsule containing a measured dose of lysergic acid diethylamide, leans back in the chair, and waits. He was not the only person of serious intellectual standing to engage with psychedelic substances in a formal research context in the late 1950s. The period between the discovery of LSD by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1943 and its eventual criminalization in 1968 was one of genuine scientific and philosophical inquiry, a window in which researchers at respectable institutions administered psychedelic substances to carefully selected subjects and attempted, with the tools available to them, to understand what the experiences produced. Aldous Huxley had written about mescaline in The Doors of Perception in 1954 with a philosophical seriousness that had changed the terms of the conversation. Watts had read Huxley. He had thought carefully about what Huxley described, and he had arrived, by his mid-40s, at a question he wanted to investigate empirically. The question was this: were the states produced by psychedelic substances phenomenologically identical, or at least closely comparable, to the states described in the classical literature of mystical experience, including the Zen literature he knew so well? Were they the same territory approached by different routes? Or were they something else entirely, chemical simulations of experience that only resembled the genuine article from the outside? He approached the experiments as a philosopher would, systematically, with careful attention to what he was experiencing and how it compared to the accounts he had spent 20 years studying. He took notes, he reflected, he discussed the experiences at length with the researchers and with his colleagues. And what he found, in those sessions at Menlo Park and in subsequent experiments, was something that complicated the picture considerably. The states the substances produced were, in his description, genuinely continuous with the mystical experience he had spent his career writing about. The dissolution of the ordinary sense of self as a separate bounded entity, the perception of what he described as the mutual interdependence of foreground and background, self and world, in which the boundary between inside and outside became, at certain moments, not a wall but a surface. The sensation, which he called not a belief but a perception, that the universe was a single process, unified and continuous, and that the ordinary experience of separateness was a useful, but not ultimately accurate map of reality. These experiences mattered to him. He wrote about them in The Joyous Cosmology, published in 1962, and the writing there is among the most precise and carefully observed of his entire body of work. But the experiments also raised a question he spent years circling, a question that had no comfortable answer. If the chemical route could produce, with reasonable reliability, the states that the traditions described as the fruit of years of dedicated practice, what did that say about the practice? And if the experience was genuine regardless of the route by which it was reached, what exactly did it mean for the gap that Suzuki had identified? The gap between the man who could describe liberation with luminous accuracy and the man who, in the ordinary hours of ordinary days, seemed no closer to it than anyone else. He described what he found in those rooms with more honesty than almost anything else he published. He also knew, without quite saying so, that the experiences, whatever they revealed about the nature of consciousness, had not closed the gap in his private life. The glass was still there at the end of the day. The restlessness was still there. The marriages were still failing in the particular way that his marriages failed. The man who had found, by chemical means, what he described as genuine mystical experience, went home to a life that the experience had not, in any measurable way, transformed. It is the winter of 1961, and Alan Watts is at his desk in Mill Valley, a town that sits just north of San Francisco, in the fold of the hills where the redwoods begin. The window is open a few inches. The air coming through it is cold and smells of wet pine. He has a cup of tea cooling at his elbow, and a draft in front of him that is unlike anything he has written before, not in its conclusions, which are familiar, but in its texture, the way it stays close to the surface of experience, rather than rising immediately to the philosophical altitude at which he was most comfortable. The Joyous Cosmology, published in 1962, was the book Watts found most difficult to write, and the difficulty was instructive. His previous books had operated from the outside of the states they described. They explained Zen from a position of philosophical understanding. They argued for the validity of mystical experience from within the framework of comparative religion. But the Joyous Cosmology attempted something different. It tried to render the actual phenomenology of the states produced by psychedelic substances from within those states, using language that was adequate to the experience, rather than merely adjacent to it. The problem he was working against was one that every serious mystic writer had confronted. Language is a tool built for the ordinary world. It is designed, in its grammar and its categories, to describe a reality in which subjects encounter objects, in which things have boundaries, in which before and after are meaningfully distinct. The states he was trying to describe were states in which those structures dissolved. The self that normally sits at the center of experience, organizing what it perceives from a stable vantage point, became, in these states, permeable. The boundary between perceiver and perceived softened. The sense of being a fixed point of view inside a body, looking out at a world that was definitively not body, gave way to something he described as the mutual arising of self and world, the sensation that the two were a single process, experienced from within, rather than two things in relation. He was not the first to try to describe this. Meister Eckhart had tried in the 14th century, in the language of Christian mysticism. The Upanishads had tried, in Sanskrit, across millennia. Suzuki had tried to translate what the Zen masters had tried. Watts was attempting to close the distance between those classical accounts and the specific, contemporary, chemical experience of a mid-century American, and to do it in prose clear enough that a reader who had never had any such experience could recognize what was being described as something more than metaphor. The book succeeded, on its own terms, in a way that surprised even its author. The prose in The Joyous Cosmology has a quality that his other writing does not quite achieve. It is slower, more careful, more willing to linger in the uncertainty of an image before resolving it. Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who wrote a preface for the book, understood it primarily as a document in support of the psychedelic research they were conducting at Harvard, and the association was not without cost to the book's intellectual reception. Critics who might have engaged seriously with Watts's philosophical argument dismissed it as advocacy, dressed in philosophical language. This was unfair, but it was also, given the cultural context of the early 1960s, almost inevitable. He was writing seriously about states of consciousness produced by substances that were, in the public imagination, moving rapidly from research tool to social danger. The serious conversation he wanted to have was already being overtaken by a louder and less careful one. He was a rigorous observer of consciousness, but he was also becoming, through no entirely voluntary process, the philosopher of a cultural movement that was considerably less rigorous than he was. Both of those things were true, and the tension between them was about to become considerably more acute. It is an evening in 1962, and the kitchen of a house in Mill Valley holds the particular silence that follows a conversation that has said everything and resolved nothing. Dorothy Watts stands at the counter with her back to the door. The children are somewhere in the house. Outside, the California evening is settling into its cool and its fog, and the man who should be sitting at this table is not here, is perhaps lecturing somewhere, perhaps with someone else, perhaps simply elsewhere, in the specific way that he was always, in the end, elsewhere. She had known who he was when she married him. That is the thing that cannot be said simply, because it was both true and insufficient. She had known he was restless, knew he needed constant motion and new rooms and new audiences. She had accepted this, at least provisionally, at least at the beginning, with the practical resilience of a woman who understood that certain kinds of men came with certain kinds of costs. What she had not fully anticipated was the cumulative weight of the pattern over years, the way each individual absence was defensible and the total was not. Watts had, by the early 1960s, achieved the audience he had been building toward for 2 decades. The Way of Zen had sold widely and continued to sell. The Esalen Institute, which opened in 1962 on the cliffs above Big Sur and quickly became the defining institution of the American human potential movement, had identified Watts as one of its essential voices and brought him back repeatedly to lecture before audiences that received him with something close to devotion. The radio broadcasts continued. The manuscripts accumulated. By any external measure, the career was at its height. The private life was a different accounting. Watts drank steadily and heavily, in the way that had become, by his late 40s, less a choice than a settled condition. He was drawn, again, to a woman who was not Dorothy. Her name was Mary Jane Yates King, and she was younger, and the attraction had the quality that Watts's attractions always had. It was genuine, it was intense, and it did not coexist comfortably with the obligations already in place. Dorothy eventually learned what she had perhaps suspected for some time. The marriage that had produced 5 children and lasted 12 years ended with the quiet finality that comes when both people have understood for long enough that the ending is the only honest conclusion. The pattern is where the analysis must pause. This was not the same mistake twice, if mistake is even the right word. Something structural was at work. Watts needed intimacy the way he needed an audience, urgently and continuously. And the difficulty was that sustained intimacy makes demands that differ fundamentally from the demands of an audience. An audience asks only to be engaged. Intimacy asks to be met. And meeting someone, in the daily and unglamorous sense of the word, required a presence of a kind that Watts could supply in extraordinary abundance to a room full of strangers, and found, in the privacy of his own home, genuinely difficult to sustain. He left as he had left before. He left with the particular composure of a man who had arranged his philosophy in such a way that departure could always be understood as honesty rather than failure. He was following his nature. He was refusing to perform a belonging he did not feel. These were not untrue things. They were also not the whole truth, and the half of the truth they omitted was visible in the faces of the children he left behind, who would spend years learning to hold two images of their father simultaneously, the voice that reached millions, and the man who could not stay in the room. He was capable of extraordinary tenderness. That tenderness did not protect the people closest to him from the consequences of his going. It is an evening in the early 1960s, and a room at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur holds perhaps 60 people, arranged in chairs and on the floor, the Pacific audible through the open windows, in a sound that is both very far away and very close. At the front of the room, Alan Watts stands without a lectern or a podium, one hand in the pocket of a jacket that is slightly too casual for a formal lecture and slightly too formal for the setting, and he begins to speak. He does not begin with a definition or a thesis. He begins with a question, asked in a tone that suggests the question is one he himself finds genuinely interesting and has not entirely resolved, and the room, which has been waiting for a performance, finds instead something that feels like an invitation. This is the particular skill that no transcript fully captures, the ability to make a room of strangers feel that they are thinking alongside him rather than receiving instruction from him. The lectures that Watts delivered at Esalen and on radio throughout the 1960s were not prepared texts read from a script. They were improvised in the deepest sense, not randomly but structurally. He would identify a territory, a concept from Zen or Vedanta or Taoism, and then move through it by association, following the logic where it led, and trusting that the movement itself would produce, at certain moments, the kind of sudden clarity he was after. The method was close to the jazz improvisation he loved to listen to, a form that required complete command of the underlying structure in order to depart from it convincingly. What the voice itself contributed cannot be separated from what it said. The accent was mid-Atlantic, neither quite English nor quite American, formed by the crossing he had made in his late 20s and never fully recalibrated. It had a quality of ease that was not casualness, but the specific ease of a man who has thought about his subject for 20 years and no longer needs to think about the thinking. The pace was deliberate without being slow. The pauses, which were frequent, had weight. He used silence the way a good teacher uses the board, as a space for the listener's understanding to settle into before the next thought arrived. The Esalen audiences were not passive. They were educated, often professionally accomplished, frequently in some form of personal crisis that their existing frameworks had failed to address. Therapists came, artists came, scientists came, people who had lost their religion and had not yet found a replacement came, in considerable numbers, and sat in this room above the Pacific and listened to a man describe the nature of consciousness in terms that were simultaneously intellectually precise and emotionally spacious enough to hold what they were actually feeling. He gave them something that was genuinely rare. He was a man of substantial philosophical education who spoke without condescension, who never performed difficulty, who seemed to believe, and to demonstrate by the quality of his attention, that the most complex ideas were accessible to any person willing to think carefully. He was wrong about some things. He simplified where he should have held the complexity. He moved past genuine difficulties with an elegance that occasionally concealed the depth of the difficulty. But the gift was real, and the recordings, which survived everything, carry it intact. The lectures were made at a cost that does not appear in any of them. The drinking preceded many of the recordings. The exhaustion of constant travel was worn by the body, even when the voice was steady. The private life was in various states of dissolution, and none of that reached the tape. What reached the tape was the voice, unrelenting in its clarity, offering to anyone who listened a picture of freedom that the man speaking it was, in the hours before and after, struggling to inhabit. The recordings were piling up, and the audience was growing, and the gap between the public figure and the private man was becoming, by degrees, structural rather than incidental. It would take one more book and one more marriage and several more years before the gap reached its fullest expression. In My Own Way was published in 1973, the last year of his life, and it is, in its way, the most revealing thing he ever wrote, though not always in the ways its author intended. The book is warm, humorous in places, and written with the assurance of a man who has made his peace with his own story. It covers his childhood in Chislehurst, the Buddhist lodge, the Canterbury years, the seminary, San Francisco, the marriages, the psychedelic experiments, the counterculture, the Esalen years. It does not shy from difficulty. He acknowledges the drinking. He acknowledges the failures of the marriages. He describes, with something approaching candor, the gap between what he taught and what he lived. But the acknowledgement has a quality worth examining closely. In Watts's telling, the failures of his private life were not failures in any conventional sense. They were expressions of an unconventional nature, of a refusal to perform a belonging he did not feel, of an honest acknowledgement that the domestic forms society prescribed were not suited to the kind of person he was. The drinking was, in his account, a tool of sorts, a means of maintaining the slightly loosened state of consciousness in which his ideas moved most freely. The departures from the marriages were not abandonments, but honest reckoning. There is something real in all of this. He was not, in writing this way, simply lying to himself. He was applying the philosophical framework that he had spent decades constructing, a framework in which the grasping ego that society asks us to maintain and defend is the source of suffering rather than its remedy, and in which the release of that ego, in whatever form it takes, is closer to wisdom than to failure. The framework is coherent. The application of it to his own life is where the coherence becomes, at moments, strained. The book is the autobiography of a man who has thought about his life through the lens of his own philosophy for so long that the lens has become transparent to him. He can no longer see around it to the view that others have of the same life. He was, in the most precise sense, a man who could not get outside his own system of understanding, not because the system was dishonest, but because it was genuinely his. He had not adopted the philosophy as a convenience. He had built it, over decades, as the truest account he could give of what existence felt like from the inside. And when he applied it to the evidence of his own biography, what emerged was a portrait that was both recognizable and, in certain places, carefully composed. He was an honest man who had arranged his understanding in such a way that honesty and self-exculpation arrived at the same destination. The autobiography is where that arrangement is most visible, and visible is not the same as false. The book appeared in 1973. He did not live to see its full reception. He was already, by the time it reached the publishers, in the final months of his life. He is 54 years old. His hair is longer than it was in the seminary years, his face broader and more weathered, and he wears the expression of a man who has arrived, after a very long journey, at the place he was trying to describe the whole time. He settles into the chair. He adjusts the microphone. He takes a breath that the recording picks up as a slight intake of air, and then he begins. The lecture series, recorded in 1969 and distributed under the title The Nature of Consciousness, represents Watts at the absolute summit of his intellectual powers. Not merely the clearest, though it is that, not merely the most influential, though it is certainly that as well. It is the work in which everything he had been assembling since those afternoons with the Japanese prince in Chislehurst arrives at its most coherent and most fully realized form. The central claim of the lectures was not new in Watts's work, but it had never been made with such systematic precision. The self, as ordinarily experienced, is not a biological fact, but a conceptual construction. The sensation of being a small, bounded individual, located behind the eyes, looking out at a world that exists independently and indifferently, is a learned interpretation of experience rather than a discovery about the structure of reality. It is, Watts argued, the most consequential mistaken belief in human history, the root from which almost all unnecessary human suffering grows. He built the argument carefully and with unusual patience, spending more time than he usually did with the phenomenological ground, asking the listener to actually attend to the experience of experience before accepting the inherited description of it. What do you actually find when you look for the looker? Where exactly is the boundary between what you call yourself and what you call the world? The grammar of the question, he pointed out, already presupposes the answer, I am here, and the world is out there, and the entire architecture of Western thought about consciousness has been built on that presupposition without ever properly examining it. The Zen tradition, the Vedanta tradition, and the Taoist tradition, he argued, were all pointing, from different angles and with different methods, at the same recognition that the boundary is not found but constructed, that the construction serves certain practical purposes, and that mistaking the map for the territory, the constructed boundary for a real one, produces in human beings a specific and chronic form of suffering. The relief from that suffering was not the acquisition of anything, it was not the achievement of any special state. It was the recognition, which could in principle occur at any moment and without any preparation, that the self doing the seeking and the liberation being sought were aspects of a single process that had never actually been divided. This is where the mid-narrative reckoning is unavoidable. Watts described this recognition with a precision and a beauty that changed people. The accounts are not anecdotal, they are voluminous, spanning decades. People heard these lectures and found something shifting in the way they understood their own experience, something that persisted, that changed the texture of ordinary days, that made the ordinary feel less like a problem and more like the thing itself. And Watts, who had described the recognition with such clarity, went home to the boat, poured a drink, felt, as he always felt, the particular restlessness that no amount of public warmth had ever quite addressed. He was a man who understood the constructed nature of the self with extraordinary precision. The construction in him was, by 1969, as solid as it had ever been. This explains what had seemed inexplicable about him. Not that the insight was false, but that understanding a thing and dissolving it in yourself are two entirely different operations. He had performed the first with genius, the second remained, and would remain, unfinished. And that gap, which the lectures illuminate from one side and his private life illuminates from the other, is the most honest thing about him. The lectures reached an audience of millions. The man who made them went largely unaltered by them. Both of those facts are true. Holding them simultaneously is the only way to understand what follows. Mary Jane Watts is in the galley, organizing something with the practical efficiency that characterized her approach to the considerable logistical demands of life with Alan Watts, a life that involved constant guests, frequent departures, an irregular income, and a husband whose relationship with ordinary domestic scheduling was, at best, approximate. She had married him in 1964, 2 years after his separation from Dorothy, and the marriage held, in the sense that it did not break, for the remaining 9 years of his life. It held for reasons that were partly a matter of her temperament and partly a matter of his having arrived, by his early 50s, at a kind of stabilization, not transformation, stabilization. The restlessness did not diminish, the drinking did not diminish, but the specific pattern of departure and beginning that had characterized his earlier decades seemed to have found, in the arrangement of the Vallejo and the freedom that Mary Jane permitted, and the career that no longer required institutional belonging, a context it could inhabit without immediately destroying. Mary Jane was practical, clear-eyed, and not inclined toward illusion about the man she had married. She understood that certain things were not going to change, and organized the life around that understanding rather than against it. This was a different kind of partnership than the ones that had preceded it, less charged and also less combustible, built on a more honest assessment of what each person could offer and what each person required. The Vallejo itself was central to this period. It was moored in Sausalito, at the Gate 5 road community of houseboats that had become, by the 1960s, one of the more unusual residential communities in the country, home to artists and musicians and writers and assorted eccentrics who found in the floating, impermanent quality of houseboat life something that suited their particular relationship to the world. For Watts, the boat was the first home that felt truly suited to his nature. It moved. It was provisional. It had no fixed foundation. It was also, in its small way, beautiful, fitted out with Japanese screens and cushions and objects gathered over decades of aesthetic devotion. He received guests on the boat constantly. Students came, seekers came, journalists came, and Watts sat with them in the main cabin, with a drink and the unhurried attention of a man who had nowhere else to be, which was partly true and partly performance, as it had always been. He lectured from the boat, recording sessions in the cabin at a portable desk. He wrote there. He watched the light on the water with a quality of attention that his longtime friends recognized as the closest he came, in ordinary life, to what he described in the lectures. He was content, in the particular way that a man is content when he has stopped fighting his own nature and has arranged his life to accommodate it. This is not the same as peace, though it resembles peace from a sufficient distance. The contentment was real, the accommodation was its condition, and accommodation, as anyone who has attempted it knows, requires something to accommodate. By the late 1960s, the drinking was no longer a habit that could be described as under control by any ordinary definition of the phrase. His friends noted it. His body was beginning to register it in ways that a doctor, had he been inclined to consult one regularly, would have found worth discussing. He was not inclined. He understood at some level what the drinking was doing. He had, in the particular way of a man who has thought about everything, thought about this too, and he had arrived at an accommodation with it, as he had arrived at accommodations with most of the fixed features of his existence. What the drinking would ultimately cost him was a question that his body was quietly in the process of answering, even as the lectures continued and the manuscripts accumulated, and the voice on the tape remained, as it had always been, perfectly steady. It is an afternoon in 1966, and a student sits across from Alan Watts in a small office at a building in San Francisco, the light coming through the window at a low angle that falls across the desk between them and catches the dust in the air. The student is perhaps 25, serious-faced, with the quality of concentrated distress that thoughtful people carry when they have understood an idea well enough to find it personally devastating rather than merely intellectually interesting. He has been studying Watts's work for 2 years. He has read The Way of Zen, he has listened to the radio broadcasts, and now he is asking, with a directness that Watts appreciates and that most of his public questioners lack, the question that the work raises and does not, he feels, quite answer. If all of this is true, the student says, if the self is a construction, if the seeking makes it worse, then what am I supposed to do about it? Watts considers this for a moment, not theatrically but genuinely. Then he says, in the tone he used when he was about to say something that was both obvious and radical, that is exactly the right question. And the fact that you are asking it as a question of what to do is why it does not yet have its answer. The argument Watts developed across the 1960s about the relationship between effort and liberation was not original to him, and he would have been the first to say so. It had deep roots in the Zen tradition's critique of seeking, in the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, the action that is not contrary to the natural flow of things, and in the Vedantic understanding that the self-seeking liberation and the liberation being sought were not two separate things. What Watts contributed was the precise and philosophically rigorous articulation of this position in terms that a Western reader, formed in a culture that understood achievement as the natural response to every deficiency, could actually engage with. The argument worked as follows. The ordinary Western response to the problem of consciousness, the feeling of being a separate, anxious self in an indifferent world, was to seek a remedy. Meditation, therapy, religious practice, philosophical understanding, all of these were attempts by the self to improve its situation. And all of them, Watts argued, were subject to the same structural difficulty. The moment you deploy the ego as the agent of your liberation from the ego, you have reinscribed the very thing you were trying to dissolve. The self trying to get rid of itself is the self at its most elaborately self-referential. The effort does not produce liberation, it produces a more sophisticated version of the problem. The resolution, if resolution is even the right word, was not a technique but a recognition. The recognition that the seeking is itself unnecessary, that the present moment, attended to with honesty rather than with an agenda, already contains what the seeking was after. This is not passivity, and it is not nihilism. It is a radical reorientation of attention, a shift from trying to achieve a state to noticing what is already the case. This argument is, at the level of philosophical analysis, serious and defensible. It has antecedents of the deepest seriousness in multiple traditions, and it had, in Watts's own life, an obvious and not entirely accidental convenience. A philosophy that describes formal practice as a potential trap, that suggests the untrained mind is not thereby at a disadvantage, that frames the ordinary moments of an imperfect life as themselves the material of understanding, is a philosophy that sits very comfortably with a man who had declined to undertake formal training, who drank too much, who could not sustain domestic commitment. Whether the philosophy was genuinely true and also personally convenient, or whether the personal convenience had shaped the philosophy in ways its author could not see, is a question that does not have a clean answer. It is, in fact, the question at the center of his entire biography, asked from the inside rather than from the outside. He gave the student in that office an answer that was both entirely correct at the philosophical level and, in the context of the life behind the desk, in the precise position of the man delivering it, something more complicated than it appeared. The student went away changed. Watts refilled his glass. Both of those things were real, and neither of them resolves the other. It is January of 1967, and Golden Gate Park is holding more people than it was designed to hold. The winter sun thin and cold over the meadow, the air smelling of incense and damp grass, and the particular human warmth of a very large crowd that believes, with varying degrees of sincerity, that something important is happening. On a stage at the east end of the park, Allen Ginsberg is chanting. Timothy Leary is somewhere in the crowd, or perhaps on the stage, in the general vicinity of the stage, and the atmosphere of the event, which will be called the human be-in, and which will be understood retrospectively as the public announcement of what the counterculture had been building toward for a decade, has the quality of a celebration searching for its occasion. Alan Watts speaks briefly. His words, delivered in that measured voice above the noise of the crowd, have a quality that the setting slightly overwhelms. They are too precise, too carefully inflected for an outdoor gathering of this scale. But they are listened to, or listened to by those close enough to hear properly, and they carry, even in this improbable context, the authority of a man who has been saying these things before most of the people in this meadow had heard of Zen Buddhism. He was not a counterculture figure in the sense of belonging to it. He was 51 years old at the human be-in, more than 2 decades older than the median age of the crowd around him, and he viewed the cultural moment with a mixture of genuine sympathy and private exasperation that he expressed, in his lectures and writings, with characteristic precision. He understood the longing that drove the counterculture, the longing for a way of inhabiting the world that was not organized entirely around the management of appearances and the accumulation of property, was a longing he recognized from his own adolescence, from Canterbury Cathedral, from the restlessness that had sent him to the Buddhist lodge at 16. It was a real longing. It pointed at a real problem. What he was less certain about was whether the counterculture, in its enthusiasm, was responding to that longing with adequate seriousness. The Zen that the Haight-Ashbury generation had absorbed was, with some exceptions, the Zen of permission rather than the Zen of discipline, the version he had criticized in Beat Zen, Square Zen and Zen nearly a decade earlier. It had kept the liberation and discarded the rigor. It had taken the conclusion without working through the argument. And Watts, who was himself regularly accused of exactly this by the formal Buddhist establishment, found the irony not entirely comfortable. He participated in the counterculture nonetheless, and participated actively, because the alternative was a kind of purity that he had always distrusted. He would rather reach the person who needed the idea imperfectly than protect the idea from imperfect use. This was philosophically consistent and practically generous. It also had costs. The association with the counterculture, with Leary's maximalist claims for psychedelic substances, with the human being and its successors, attached to Watts's name a quality of cultural moment that made it easier, in subsequent decades, to dismiss him as a product of the 1960s rather than a serious thinker who had been at work 20 years before the decade began. The counterculture used him as well as he used it. The exchange was mutual and not without its distortions. He reached an audience of millions, and the millions received a version of his ideas that was already slightly filtered through the cultural assumptions of the moment, slightly softened, slightly more permissive in its implications than the ideas, examined carefully, actually were. When the decade ended, as all decades do, with the sudden sobriety that follows excess, the ideas that had travelled under the counterculture's protection were left in a position that required reassessment, and Watts, who had foreseen some of this and not others, sat on his boat in Sausalito and continued to work, as he had always worked, which was to say without stopping, which was to say unrelentingly, which was to say as though the working were the only answer he had to all the questions that the work itself kept raising. It is a morning in the early 1970s, and the main cabin of the Vallejo holds the specific stillness of a space where someone has been working for several hours without interruption. Papers are arranged on the desk with more care than usual. A pot of green tea sits on the small stove. Outside, the harbour is quiet, the water smooth, the light coming off the bay at a low angle that turns everything the colour of old silver. Watts sits at the desk, reading back what he has written, his lips moving slightly as they do when he is testing the rhythm of a sentence, and he makes a small correction and reads it again, and this time does not correct it. The work he was doing in the final 3 years of his life had a different quality from even the best of what had preceded it. The change is audible in the late recordings, visible in the manuscript of Tao, The Watercourse Way, which he was writing at the time of his death, and which was completed and published posthumously in 1975. Something had eased, not the intelligence which remained entirely intact, not the range which remained extraordinary, but the quality of struggle, the faint note of effort visible in the earlier work at moments when Watts was trying to make an idea carry more than it could quite hold, had largely gone. The Taoism he returned to in these final years was not new to him. The Tao Te Ching and the Chuang Tzu had been in his reading since his 20s, and their influence was visible across all his mature work. But in the early 1970s, he committed to Taoism as his primary frame in a way he had not previously allowed himself, and the commitment produced a philosophical synthesis that was, in certain respects, more honest than his earlier formulations. The core of the Taoist framework, as Watts understood and presented it, was the concept of the Tao itself, the underlying process of the universe, which cannot be named or grasped as an object, but which is apparent in everything, as the grain of wood is apparent in any piece of lumber, as the pattern of flow is apparent in any moving water. The Taoist sage is not someone who has achieved a special state, but someone who moves in accordance with the grain rather than against it, who has given up the particular exhaustion of self-assertion and found, in that relinquishment, not loss, but ease. This framing addressed, with more directness than Watts had previously managed, the question that his private life had always been asking. He was a man who had spent most of his life moving against the grain of his own nature, trying to inhabit institutional forms that did not fit, trying to sustain domestic commitments that his restlessness outran, trying to produce, through effort and will, a version of himself that was continuous and reliable in ways that his actual self was not. The Taoist frame did not excuse this, but it placed it within a philosophical context in which the struggle itself, and the recognition of the struggle's futility, was part of the pattern rather than an embarrassment to be managed. He was writing about ease from inside a life that had never been particularly easy. He was describing the Tao, the way of least resistance, from the position of a man who had spent 60 years taking routes of considerable resistance. The recognition of this, which appears between the lines of the late work, is the closest he came to the honesty that the autobiography attempted and only partially achieved. He had stopped performing wisdom in the late work and had begun, in some quieter register, to actually sit with the questions rather than answer them. The sitting had a quality that the earlier brilliance did not, and he had, by the time the manuscript was nearly finished, very little time remaining in which to pursue it. It is an evening in the autumn of 1973, and the deck of the Vallejo holds one man, and the sound of the water and the lights of Sausalito reflected across the bay in long broken lines. Alan Watts sits in a deck chair with a glass in his hand, and the specific stillness of a man who has nothing more to prove and knows it, which is either a form of peace or a very convincing approximation of one. The air is cool. There is fog somewhere over the hills to the west. He has been recording earlier in the day, and the tape in the cabin is still in the machine, waiting to be rewound or played back or simply left. He was 58 years old. His liver was failing in the way that a liver fails in a man who has been drinking heavily for 30 years, quietly and then not so quietly, with the incremental losses that the body registers before the mind consents to. His doctor had given him information he chose to receive as information rather than instruction. He was not, by this point, in the business of receiving instruction from anyone about anything, which was both a philosophical position and a personal habit so long established that the distinction between the two had collapsed. The question that the drinking raises is one that demands more than the obvious answer. The obvious answer is self-destruction, the ordinary sad story of a man who could not stop doing the thing that was killing him. This is not wrong, but it is not sufficient. Watts had thought about the drinking as carefully as he thought about everything else, and what he wrote and said about it, in the places where he addressed it directly, suggested a relationship with the substance that was more considered than compulsion alone would explain. Alcohol, in his account, loosened the grip of the deliberate self. It produced a slight relaxation of the monitoring function, the internal editor that governed ordinary social performance, and in that relaxation, his ideas moved more freely. This was not a rationalization invented after the fact. There is evidence in the lectures themselves that the slight alteration of state that preceded many of the recordings produced something genuine, a quality of ease, a willingness to follow an idea wherever it led without the anxiety of consequence, that the recordings carry and that his colleagues noticed. This does not mean the drinking was wise. It means it was not simple. He was a man who understood, with philosophical precision, the cost of self-consciousness, the way the monitoring ego interfered with direct experience, and who had found, in alcohol, a crude but reliable way of reducing that interference. The crudeness was the problem. The chemical diminishment of self-consciousness is not the same as its philosophical dissolution, any more than anesthesia is the same as surgery, but it produced effects that resembled, from a certain angle, the effects he had been describing for 40 years. He was, by the autumn of 1973, a man who had made his peace with most things, or who had arranged his life in such a way that peace and accommodation were no longer easily distinguished. The work continued. The guests came. Mary Jane managed the practical dimensions of the life with the calm competence she had always brought to them, and Watts sat on the deck in the evenings and watched the water and felt, or performed, or genuinely inhabited something that looked very much like contentment. He was recording still. He was planning a lecture tour of Europe. He was corresponding with students on several continents. He was, in other words, doing everything except the one thing his own philosophy suggested was most important, which was to rest, to stop, to allow the present moment to be sufficient, without the requirement that it also be productive. He was incapable of stopping, and that incapacity was, depending on how you held it, the most human thing about him, or the most Taoist, or the most heartbreaking, possibly all three simultaneously. The tour was scheduled, the tickets were purchased, he was going to Europe. It is the early morning of the 16th of November 1973, and a room in a chalet in Druseg, in the Swiss canton of Fribourg, holds the silence that follows the end of a life. The window gives onto mountains that are dark at this hour, the sky just beginning to separate from the ridgeline to the east. On the desk, a tape recorder sits with a reel still loaded from the previous evening. The man in the bed does not wake. Alan Watts was found dead in his sleep, the cause recorded as heart failure. He was 58 years old. He had been on a European lecture tour, having travelled from the Vallejo to a gathering of friends and students in Switzerland, and the tour had been going well by the accounts of those who had seen him in the preceding days. He had lectured the evening before. He had been in good spirits, by which those present meant he had been exactly himself, talking with the ease and the warmth that had defined every room he ever entered, finding the idea in the conversation and following it with the attention that was his most consistent gift. The manner of his death was quiet, which is either appropriate or ironic, depending on what you expected. A man who had spent his career arguing against the ego's terror of annihilation died, as far as anyone could determine, without apparent distress. Whether he faced those final moments with the equanimity he had described in thousands of hours of recorded speech, or whether the equanimity was irrelevant because the end came without warning, is a question the record cannot answer. Both possibilities carry their own weight. He had spent his life arguing that death, properly understood, was not the catastrophe that Western culture treated it as. The ego that fears death is the same construction that makes living unnecessarily painful. The recognition of impermanence is not a reason for grief, but for a different and more honest relationship with what is. He had said these things with total conviction in lecture halls and recording studios and on the deck of the Vallejo looking at the water. He had said them to students in crisis and to friends in grief and to audiences of strangers who had come hoping to hear exactly this. He died in his sleep, in a borrowed room, far from his family, in the middle of a lecture tour, with a tape recorder on the desk, and the mountains outside beginning to catch the first light. There is no evidence that he suffered. There is no evidence that he did not. The tape was still loaded in the machine. No one knows whether this was habit or intention, or simply the way things were left. He had been, for 50 years, a man in the act of recording himself. The recording had not quite finished when the man stopped, and so the question of what the drinking would ultimately cost him finds its answer, quietly, in a room in Switzerland, at 58 years old. It is sometime in the mid-1980s, and a dormitory room in a university somewhere in the American Midwest holds a second-hand cassette player and a young man of 19 who cannot sleep. A friend had pressed a tape into his hands that afternoon and said simply, "Listen to this." The young man pressed play with moderate skepticism, the skepticism of someone who has been recommended things before and found them adequate. The voice that comes out of the cassette player in the thin light of that room is not adequate. It is something else entirely. The young man listens for 3 hours, and at the end of 3 hours he does not go to sleep. He rewinds the tape and listens again. This scene, or some version of it, happened countless times across the 2 decades following Watts's death. The recordings traveled through networks that had nothing to do with academic publishing or radio broadcast schedules, passed hand to hand in the informal economy of meaningful things, duplicated and reduplicated until the tape hiss accumulated, and the voice behind it remained unchanged, still unhurried, still precise, still carrying the quality of absolute unruffled intelligence that had made it famous in the first place. What the recordings transmitted was real. This is the essential point, and it requires stating plainly, because the distortions that accompanied the transmission were also real, and the two things must be held simultaneously. The ideas in the lectures were genuine. The experience of hearing them, for a person encountering them without preparation, was frequently transformative in ways that persisted. The transformation was not illusory. Many people, across many decades and many circumstances, found in Watts's voice a clarity about the nature of experience that changed the texture of their own experience, and the change was durable. What the transmission could not carry was the life. The cassette tape, the LP record, the radio broadcast, and eventually the digital file, all delivered the voice without the man behind it. This was not a failure of the medium, but a characteristic of it. The biographical fact that the voice belonged to a man who had been expelled from a seminary, who had left 2 families, who drank heavily throughout the decades of the recordings, who died at 58 of causes substantially related to that drinking, none of this arrived with the tape. The listener received the wisdom without the cost of it, the clarity without the reckoning behind it. This is a distortion, and it matters, not because the wisdom becomes less true when the life is known, but because the life, known alongside the wisdom, makes the wisdom more honest. A man who describes liberation and inhabits it cleanly is one kind of teacher. A man who describes liberation and struggles visibly and extensively to inhabit it is a different kind, and in some ways a more useful one. He demonstrates in the evidence of his own biography that the understanding he describes is genuinely difficult to live, that the difficulty is not a character flaw, but an honest measure of the gap between comprehension and embodiment that any serious attempt at this kind of understanding will encounter. The simplified Watts, the voice without the man, reached further than the complicated Watts could have. What the 1960s context compressed and distorted, the recordings outlasted, arriving decades later in rooms that had never heard of Esalen or the human being, carrying the ideas stripped of their moment and therefore, in some ways, more available. The question of whether that selective transmission honored or betrayed him has no clean answer. He wanted to reach everyone. He did. The reckoning attached to that reach was left on the boat in Sausalito, with the water and the fog and the glass on the rail. It is an afternoon in the late 1980s, and a Zen teacher in a practice center in Northern California is sitting with a student who has just discovered Watts and is excited about what he has found and wants to know why, if the ideas are this good, the serious Buddhist world does not treat Watts as a central figure. The teacher is quiet for a moment. Then he says something that is not quite a defense and not quite a dismissal, which means it is probably the most honest available response. The formal Buddhist critique of Alan Watts was consistent across the decades of his career, and consistent in its essential point. He did not practice. He had not submitted himself to a teacher within a living transmission lineage. He had not sat through the long, difficult, unremarkable hours of formal meditation practice that the tradition held to be the non-negotiable condition of genuine understanding. He had read widely and thought brilliantly, and written beautifully about a territory he had not, in the tradition's own terms, properly entered. He was an extraordinarily gifted tourist in a country that required residency. This criticism had force, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The Zen tradition, in particular, had good reasons for insisting on the lineage requirement. The transmission of Zen was understood not as the transmission of information, which books could accomplish perfectly well, but as the transmission of a living recognition from a teacher who had it to a student who was becoming capable of it. The recognition was not an idea. It could not be extracted from the relationship in which it was transmitted. Watts's claim to speak about Zen from a position of genuine understanding was, from within this framework, a claim he had not earned by the tradition's own standards. And yet, the tradition's framework was not the only relevant one, and Watts was not engaged in the same project as the tradition. He was not attempting to transmit Zen in the formal sense, not claiming to be a Roshi or a Dharma heir or a teacher within a recognized lineage. He was attempting something different, to extract from multiple Asian philosophical traditions the philosophical core that he believed had genuine relevance to Western minds suffering in specific and identifiable ways, and to communicate that core in language adequate to the suffering he was addressing. That project had a different standard of success than formal transmission. Its standard was, did the ideas, communicated clearly, produce genuine shift in the people who received them? Did the philosophical framework offer something real to the person in crisis that their existing frameworks did not? The evidence, accumulated across decades and across millions of encounters with the recordings, suggests the answer was yes. Not always, not perfectly, not as a substitute for sustained practice in those who wanted or needed sustained practice, but often enough, and substantively enough, to constitute a genuine contribution. The critics who argued he was operating without a license were correct about the license. They were addressing a different practice than the one he was actually engaged in, and conflating the two produced a criticism that was accurate in its terms and beside the point in his. He was not a Zen master who failed to train. He was a philosopher of consciousness who used Zen, among other traditions, as his primary source. Judged by that description of his actual project, the criticism lands differently. He was unqualified by one standard and more than qualified by another. The question of which standard applies depends entirely on what you think he was doing, and that question reasonable people have answered differently for 50 years, which is itself a measure of how much remains unresolved in the legacy he left. It is sometime in the 2010s, and a voice is coming out of a laptop speaker in a kitchen in London, or a pair of earbuds in a commuter train in Tokyo, or a phone propped against a cereal box in a flat in Auckland at 7 in the morning. The voice is unhurried and precise. It is saying something about the nature of the self, about the sensation of being a bounded individual in an indifferent universe, and it is saying it with a calm that the person listening finds almost impossibly reassuring, as though the calmness were itself a form of argument. The voice belongs to a man who has been dead for 50 years. Watts's digital afterlife is one of the more unusual phenomena in the intellectual history of the 20th century. The recordings that accumulated across his Esalen years and his radio broadcasts and his studio sessions on the Vallejo have, in the decades since his death, reached an audience that dwarfs anything he knew in life. YouTube channels devoted entirely to his lectures accumulate tens of millions of views. His voice is used in ambient music compilations that are listened to by people who have never heard his name and who encounter, embedded in a drone and a slow pulse, fragments of sentences about the illusion of the separate self, and find those fragments inexplicably comforting. Meditation applications feature his recordings alongside clinical mindfulness instruction, and the pairing is not inappropriate. The ideas travel. That is the fact. They travel stripped of their context, separated from the San Francisco of 1962 and the Esalen of 1967 and the houseboat of 1973, and they arrive in a bedroom in 1997, or a commuter train in 2015, or a hospital waiting room in 2022, and they do something. Not always the same thing, not always the thing Watts intended, but something. This reach would have pleased him enormously, and he would have been characteristically honest about why. He wanted to be heard. The desire to be heard was as constitutive of his nature as the desire to understand, and the two were not entirely separate. He thought out loud, in front of people, because the presence of people sharpened the thinking. The audience was not merely instrumental, it was part of the process. What the digital afterlife cannot provide is the resistance that a living teacher provides. A recording cannot respond to the specific error in your specific understanding. It cannot notice that you have heard the words without hearing what the words were trying to point at. It delivers its content with perfect fidelity and without the friction that genuine instruction requires. This is a limitation, and it is real. It is also, given the alternative of those ideas reaching no one, a limitation worth accepting. He wanted to reach everyone. He did. The cost of that reach, what it required of him personally, what it meant that the voice offering liberation belonged to a man whose private hours told a different story, is not in any of the recordings. That part was never captured, and the question of what it means that the unrecorded part is the most relevant part, the part that would make the transmission most honest if it were included, is the question that the digital files cannot answer, and that the final accounting of his life must face directly. It is dawn in the Swiss mountains, and the room where a man died the previous night is catching the first grey light through the window. The tape recorder on the desk is still loaded. The mountains outside are becoming visible in stages. First the ridgeline, and then the trees, and then the individual rocks and hollows of the slope, as though the world is assembling itself again from nothing, which is, in a sense, what it does every morning, and which is, in another sense, what Watts spent his entire life pointing at. He had not stopped the tape recorder before he went to sleep. No one can say whether this was accident, or habit so ingrained it was no longer a decision, or something quieter, the act of a man who, after 50 years of speaking, simply did not bother to stop. The reels held a session from the evening before. A lecture, most likely, or the beginning of one. The voice on the tape was, as it had always been, steady and unhurried, and entirely itself. He died at 58, and the world he left behind had more of him in it than he had managed to keep for himself. This is perhaps the most precise statement of his legacy, the overflow. What he gave outran what he retained, and the giving was not self-sacrifice in any noble sense, but simply the nature of a man for whom transmission was prior to accumulation, for whom the idea reaching another mind mattered more, in the moment of its reaching, than the management of the self doing the transmitting. What permanently changed because he existed is not a doctrine or a school or an institution. He founded none of these things deliberately, and the ones that formed around his ideas without his instigation are mixed in their relationship to what he actually thought. What changed was the conversational possibility. Before Watts, the ideas of Zen and Vedanta and Taoism were available in English, but they were not available in the specific form he gave them, grounded in Western philosophy, responsive to Western psychology, addressed directly to the Western existential predicament without condescension in either direction. He made a certain kind of conversation possible that was not possible before, and the conversation has continued, in ways he did not anticipate and would not in all cases have endorsed, for half a century since his death. Later generations reshaped him in directions that the life itself would complicate had it been known. They made him serene, they made him a sage. They took the voice and removed from it the glass at the elbow, and the marriages in ruins, and the children grown up in the particular solitude of a father who was always, in some final sense, somewhere else. The serenity was not fabricated, it was present in the voice. But it coexisted, in the actual life, with everything else, and the coexistence is the thing the simplified version misses entirely. And so the question finds its answer, though not the answer most people expected, and not the answer that resolves cleanly. The question was, how does a man spend a lifetime teaching liberation and fail to free himself? And the answer is this: he did not fail to understand liberation. He understood it with a clarity that remains, 50 years on, difficult to surpass. What he could not do, or would not do, or found constitutionally impossible to do, was close the distance between the understanding and the life. And that distance, which looked from the outside like hypocrisy or self-indulgence, was from the inside the most honest possible demonstration of what he was describing. The gap between comprehension and embodiment is precisely the gap that his philosophy identified as the central difficulty of human consciousness. He did not resolve it, he inhabited it, fully and without pretense, for 58 years, and described it from the inside with such precision that millions of people, hearing the description, recognized their own condition in it, and felt, briefly and genuinely, less alone. The tape recorder on the desk in Druseg is still. The mountains outside the window are fully lit now. The reel has not moved since the night before. He was the most eloquent possible argument for the difficulty of the thing he was arguing was possible. That is either a tragedy or the deepest kind of honesty available to a human life. Possibly, as with everything else about him, it is both. And so we reach the end of our journey through the life of Alan Watts. Thank you for walking with me through a story that refuses, as he refused, to settle into anything simple. If this documentary moved you, leave a like and subscribe to The Long Shadow so you never miss another life worth this kind of attention. And I genuinely want to know, do you believe a person can transmit a truth they cannot fully live and have that truth still be worth receiving? I will be reading your thoughts in the comments.